you can't control what the spider's going to do. So, I mean, that, and the same is true of where people do become possessed. Then, I mean, however you want to explain what the state of possession is or means, people are not, whatever their conscious intentions are before this happens, when possessed, their intentions have no sway. So yeah, I think kind of completely blanket cynicism doesn't actually correspond to how people live their lives around the world.
Welcome to Coffee and Divination, a podcast about the arts of obtaining hidden knowledge in changing times. Join me, Joanna Farrar, to chat with experts from around the world on tarot, runes, geomancy, and the many ways divination can help us navigate and plan our paths ahead.
In today's episode, I am honored to welcome Professor David Zeitlyn from the University of Oxford. Professor Zeitlyn is a distinguished anthropologist whose work focuses on the anthropology of divination and cultural knowledge systems. He is the author of Mambila Divination, Framing Questions, Constructing Answers, a deep dive into the fascinating practice of spider divination among the Mambila people of Cameroon and Nigeria. He is also the co-curator of the Bodleian Library's new exhibition, which just opened, Oracles, Omens, and Answers, which explores the universal human practice of seeking knowledge of the unknown. This exhibition, which we discuss in the episode today, is accompanied by a newly published book, Divinations, Oracles, and Omens, which is now available through Bodleian Library Publishing. Our discussion today touches on the incredible artifacts featured in the exhibition, the history and anthropology of divination, and the cultural significance of practices that continue today, like spider divination. We also explore how these traditions inform our understanding of divination in our modern world. Before we dive into this episode, I'd also like to share some exciting news some of you have heard. My co-high priestess, Denise Crucy, and I will be presenting at the Sacred Space Conference here in the U.S. in March 2025. That's going to be near D.C. Sacred Space is a phenomenal yearly event which features incredible spiritual practitioners and teachers, and tickets are available. So you can find all the details in the show notes, and I hope to see some of you there. As always, if you enjoy this podcast, please consider subscribing, leaving a 5-star review, which really helps us, and sharing it with friends who might also love exploring these topics. And don't forget to follow me on Instagram at Coffee and Divination for a lot more. For now, enjoy this episode and let's dive in.
So it is my pleasure to have on the show Professor David Zeitlyn. You have heard about his amazing background, and I am honored to have him here as a guest to speak about a number of things related to his expertise. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So we have a traditional first question here on the podcast, and I think that it will tie very neatly into how we're going to start discussing the exhibition, which is, what was your first introduction to divination? Was it something that you encountered as a child, or you were fascinated with, or you kind of were first drawn to it many, many years later when you were an adult? It's just basically like, what was your first encounter with it, or why were you first fascinated with it?
Thank you. Okay, so my answer is not going to be a standard answer. I'm a social anthropologist. I've been working with a relatively small group in Cameroon since 1985, and I've been going back every year, apart from a minor hiccup during COVID. And so it must have been in 1985. I was relatively new in the village, and it was in Daytona, and we were going to a work party in a coffee field. They grow coffee, and you have to clear the undergrowth. and Ndedona stopped on the way and started whittling a little bit of vine and paying great attention to how the little bits came off. And I don't know why he chose then to do it. I think he actually just found the vine and he had something on his mind. And that is a form of Mambila divination. People, it's rough and ready. It's easily done. People don't take the results very seriously. If it's serious, you go to the spiders. And part of the reason that you take there's lots of reasons why you take spiders seriously. One of them is that you can test it, and they do test the results regularly, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So that was literally the first time I saw Mambila divination. Then a lot of my work for my doctorate was about disputes in the chief's court, the local village court, and how these get resolved. And important issues like accusations of theft, accusations of adultery, and actually, in the long term, choice of the new chief are resolved by reference to spider divination. And so, because I was studying dispute resolution, I had to engage with spiders, forms of spider divination. And so I had lots of conversations with diviners, and in the end, learned to do it myself. So I am a qualified initiated diviner. And when I go back, I continue. I don't practice by myself. I always kind of work with someone. But I continue to study it. I continue to learn. Because it's one of those weird things that the basic rules are very simple, but in operation you get very quickly into complication and nuance, if I'm allowed to say that word. Is that an answer?
Oh yes, absolutely. It's a fascinating answer. Yeah. That is an amazing, entryway as well. So that's really wonderful to hear about. And we are going to talk more about that whole process and that art of divination a little bit later. But so we then have, without going too far ahead of ourselves, you are then the co-curator of this exhibition. So where did the idea for this exhibition, and also the book, kind of come from? I mean, how did you kind of get to this stage of where you are right now with this about to come out?
Thank you. Right. So Michelle Aroney, my co-curator, is a medieval historian. So she works on ancient astrology. Ancient old astrology. Ancient astrology is way, way older. She works on medieval astrology, and she organized a conference about a book to celebrate Keith Thomas's Religion and the Decline of Magic, which referred itself a lot to anthropology. And so she invited me to come and talk about contemporary anthropology and contemporary views of divination and oracles. And basically, we got on really well and we had really interesting conversations. And I had been talking to the Bodleian Library about the possibility of some sort of exhibition to do with divination. And Michelle basically just joined in these conversations, and the Bodleian said, let's do it. So we've done it. So the exhibition, so Michelle and I have had so much fun organizing it, because we've been having discussions with all the specialist curators in the Bodleian Library and looking at all the manuscripts behind the scenes, and then we had to make these horrible decisions because there's only so much you can put in. But the combination of the Bodleian's archives plus other museums in Oxford, where you've got the History of Science Museum, because we've got astrolabes, which were used in early astrology, sorry. And then we've got the Ashmolean Museum, which I think is the oldest museum, if not in Europe, then in the world. You can argue about that, but they've got cuneiform tablets. And so we have a cuneiform tablet recording divination in ancient Mesopotamia, and there I do mean ancient. Then there's the Pitt Rivers Museum, which is the university's ethnographic museum. From there, we've got oracle bones, we've got instruments of Ifa, the Yoruba divination system, and Zambian basket divination. And the thing I particularly relish about this exhibition is that we're not just displaying forms of divination in the European tradition. It really does cover the whole world and across a really long period of time. So I can't remember how old the oracle bones are, 3,000 years, something like that. They are a form of divination that predates the I Ching.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the other, so we've got some extraordinary manuscripts. We've also got contemporary material. We've got and we've got the forms of divination completely outside the European tradition, and we don't always take it seriously. So, there are childhood games which are in effect a form of divination, pulling leaves off a flower, he loves me not, or, the rhyme Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, originally that's who will I marry? You count plum stones round your plate. If you're having a stew of plums, and you count them up, and it's Tinker Tailor, and that's the occupation of the person you will marry. And we have a very weird manuscript from the 1950s working with English school children then, where people were doing that sort of divination using bus tickets. And they were looking at the numbers on the bus tickets, and from whether it was odd or even or something, weirdly working out who they would marry. Yeah. So there's a range. When I was talking about Mambila divination just now, there are lots of different sorts of Mambila divination, and some people who are completely committed to spider divination will dismiss as being just a game. But the thing is that sometimes what starts as a game can become quite serious. I know of someone who's done some work with tarot card readings and hen parties. Some people go into another room and it's just a bit of fun, but then it flips. It suddenly gets serious, and it's that juggling that I'm intrigued by. So our first case in the exhibition starts with Magic 8 Ball and Cootie Cutters, those kind of childhood games, and then ends at the far end with kind of books on tide tables, astronomy, not astrology, and weather forecasting.
Yeah.
So, how do you make sense of the uncertain?
Yeah, and I think it also has to do with the idea that the systems, well, we'll get into this when we're talking about systems that involve, something like spiders, this immediately kind of is a different way of thinking of it. But there is the idea that the systems themselves, because there's an element of chaos and an element of chance involved in it, then that is kind of the universe's sense of play, in a sense that like the idea of chaos and the idea of that randomness has to be involved in the system in some way in order for it to function. And so then that immediately, ties into art and play and how kids and humans instinctively interact with the environment. You know what I mean? So I'm fascinated with that as well, believe me. So, and I always tell the story that there's a set of cards I have that are very cutesy. They have little cats on them, like Kitten Oracle. A friend of mine gave them to me, and I think she thought that they were just going to be like a little game, a little laugh, because she knows of my fascination. Turns out those cards are some of the best cards I own. They give very serious answers to people, even though they look like little cute kittens. So, it's kind of funny. It helps people laugh when they see them, but then the information that comes through can be very serious. So it's like, it's a good juxtaposition of that, like, oh,
yeah,
look.
that is interesting. I mean, why one set of cards fits one set of problems and another is, I'm not sure how to answer the question.
No.
But I mean, clearly people feel that. And I've talked to an art historian about the kind of the iconography of tarot cards and why and whether the meanings would be different if it was a set of cards you'd drawn yourself as opposed to one that you'd been given or bought. But again, it ends up, these are questions that are easy to ask and perhaps impossible to answer. That,
Yeah, how it all works. I usually just go with, well, I don't know. I just work here. So
yeah.
But it is true. And that's that's obviously part of the reason for this podcast is that generally when I have people on who are diviners, the answers that they give they can be very similar. They can also be very different because our experiences of these things, they have commonalities, but there's also great differences in how people really interpret why it works, and how they come to the cards. But there is always some relationality with it, which I think is at the heart of it, that you are receiving information from some source that is not yourself generally. I mean, it could be that the conception is of like a higher self or something, subconscious, collective unconscious, whatever you want, but that it is, coming from somewhere, which means that you have to have some form of relationship with it, which I'm sure we're going to talk about with the spiders.
Yeah.
Now it's like we're just teasing this spider section of the interview just ridiculously. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about the exhibition before we get there, because you already mentioned just an unbelievable selection of things that are going to be presented, and that I'm sure at least some of which will be in the book and discussed by various experts. What is one of your favorite? You've already mentioned a few things that you like, but what would you have to say is one of your favorite things that you want to like highlight for people that is going to be on display?
Right. Okay. I want to talk about a particular book and a juxtaposition about how it's displayed. So the particular book is a book of geomancy, which is interpreting patterns of, you make dots in the sand or the dust and you interpret the pattern. But this is it's an illuminated manuscript, an illuminated book, which was given to King Richard II. And I should have looked up his dates. Is it 14th century? I think it's 14th century. Anyway, I mean, and so it is a completely beautiful book. And because it was given to a king, it is beautifully produced. And basically, the persons who commissioned the book were touting for work. They were looking for work from Richard II. We don't actually know if it got used.
I was just about to say, was he a practitioner? Because that I'm not sure.
Well, no, he wouldn't. It would have been the person who created the book.
I see.
The king would have been the client.
I understand. Of course. Yes, that obviously makes sense. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Right. So the juxtaposition is that book is displayed alongside the book written by Joan Quigley, who was the astrologer to the Reagans in the White House.
Yeah.
Because both of those books are about giving advice to super powerful people.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I just enjoy looking at the two together. Unfortunately, the Joan Quigley book isn't as beautiful as the Richard II one, but
Not illuminated
the
manuscript.
story they tell is implicitly very similar.
Oh, that is really, really fantastic. And I would absolutely love to see that. And it does kind of, I think, tie into something which is a theme both in astrology and other forms of divination, is its relationship to power and its relationship to those in power, which I think I love that you are juxtaposing that and helping people see that that is not something that died out 2,000 years ago or anything of that nature. It's still
Exactly.
arguably used.
And we've also, I mean, there's also a section on bibliomancy, which, you know, opening the Bible or the Holy Quran, or there's a whole raft of different sacred texts where you open at random and pick a verse. I think this is in the book, not in the exhibition in the end. Winston Churchill used it, which not many people know this, but he actually wrote about doing this. It's no secret, but you know, and yeah, it's we
Churchill and his sort of intuition that he followed is very fascinating.
yeah.
Not talk about, you're right. No one's like thinking that Winston Churchill was a, you know, intuition trusting type of leader, but absolutely.
Yeah. So it's yeah, it's a there it's you know, those sorts of, I mean, the cuneiform tablet is about a I think I'm right in remember about a royal sacrifice.
Yeah.
And really irritatingly, we know what the question is. We don't know what the answer was because the tablet is broken.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think so you mentioned that you have some of the Chinese oracle bones. I think that was mentioned,
Yeah.
that's a part of it. And that was also associated, that was really just for leaders, that was only for the royalty. Or are there examples of
They
it
were
that it is?
used quite widely.
No, but that there is that relationship of many of these forms of divination. While divination, what we were saying at the very beginning is that, of course, like this is related to children's games. It's something you can just pick a flower or a vine and you can do this. So it's not to say that divination is only for people who are in power in any day or age, because this is, if it's a part of human nature, it's part of all human nature.
Mm.
But that some forms of well, for example, like astrology and certain forms that required an enormous amount of resources or time or expertise, those may have been, especially in the earlier times, more associated with people who had the resources to have those people divine for them, which is going to be ultimately people that are in the power structure, as
Yeah.
opposed to
Oh, yeah. Okay.
asking a question about who you'll marry necessarily. That's very,
Certainly,
very
one of the cuneiform, one of the cuneiforms of Mesopotamian, Mesopotamian consultations asked something about going to war, and then added on, and the king has toothache.
It's also very important. If you have a toothache, that is a very serious matter.
Yeah, you need to sort that out.
So basically one of the questions that I have is that we've already talked about it. Like there was the example of the cuneiform tablet where part of it, the answer is broken off. So we have the question, we don't have the answer. And I think about this a lot. I'm fascinated with the practice of augury and some of the forms of divination that the Greeks and the Romans practiced. That's one of my particular areas of interest. And it's always interesting to me. Everyone mentions augury. They talk about the practices with, you know, various bird and weather divination systems. And yet, for all that it was extremely common, there are things about it and the way that it was interpreted that we just don't know. We just don't have. Partially, maybe it was oral, and partially it was just that those texts are lost. So that's a relationship between archaeology and the study of these practices where there's only so much we have in the records, and then we have to do a lot of heavy lifting of interpreting. So how do you think about that relation? I mean, you are obviously with what you do, what you are a professor of, how do you think about that tension point between archaeology and how we then do the work of interpreting it, especially when it comes to divination, which is all about interpretation, really?
Yeah. The only thing you can do is just try and keep super aware of what you don't have. And so, I mean, there is this classic distinction, which goes back to Cicero and even before, between what he calls inspired versus technical or mechanical. So whether there are techniques or are you possessed by a spirit? And if you're possessed by a spirit, well, it's far harder to document. And when it's a technique, there are manuals about how to do it. Most of the classical Greek oracles were forms of divine inspiration. You were possessed by the spirit. And so we have records of the questions that were asked, and in some cases the answers, but what actually the rituals were, there's next to no evidence of. So there's archaeology of some of the sites, but they really don't give very much information about what took place there. And that is a problem. We have a chapter in the book by someone who studies Greek oracles, and she's very conscious of this and is trying to push the archaeology to see what you can get. But the sort of problem, and this is where you can get some help from different forms of contemporary divination, not only from Africa, from other places too, that and it goes back to questions of interpretation. Some people, when inspired, do what, in the Christian tradition, talking in tongues. And the person who is inspired may not remember anything, afterwards they know nothing. And they may not know what they said. You need somebody else who is a sort of translator or interpreter that stands between the person who was divinely inspired and the clients, and they kind of translate one form of language into another. So my line then is that because of that process of translation interpretation, there's actually less difference between the two different forms than it seems at first, because there's always someone doing the interpretation.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree that line is, I think, one that, especially in the modern day, we like to try to hold to it because it makes it feel, I don't know, we love categorizing things anyway, but that also I think leads people to a slightly skewed vision of what is really going on when there is elements of inspiration. And this, I think, as a practitioner, I would say there's, no matter which tool you're using, there's elements of inspiration. It's just which degree you're getting to. Is it an actual full possession trance where the person has, as you were saying, no recollection of what was said or, during that process. And of course, someone else is going to have to be involved in that, or even just a mild sort of change of consciousness when looking at tarot cards, which might be a slight shift that still could count as inspired in some way. It depends on your point of view, depends on how extreme the case is, but that's a little more nuanced than people sometimes talk about.
For example, in the chapter in the book about basket divination, in order to become a basket diviner, you have to become possessed, and you learn divination to manage and make life kind of manageable, the possession, well, it's sort of described as an illness, but by becoming a diviner, it all becomes manageable, and you've gained a useful occupation that can earn you a living. So, but when you are actually divining, you aren't then possessed.
Yeah.
It was your qualification to practice.
Interesting. Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah.
And yeah,
being sort of like a container, then by having that, there's also separation and a way to manage it. Well, yeah.
Exactly.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So I think now at this point, we have mentioned the basket divination. I am now very curious. I have all sorts of questions for you about the spider divination practices. So it from what I know about it, it involves spiders, but does it also involve like land crabs at
Yes.
times? Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
So can you
they
give us
both
an overview of how it would be practiced, maybe for someone who has not heard of it before?
Right. Okay. So the spiders are big. They're tarantulas. And the crabs are very similar size, and both of them live in holes in the ground. And diviners say, well, the dead are in the ground, and so somehow there's some commerce. They're a bit vague about this, and some would say there are ancestors, and that the spiders are speaking to the ancestors. And when I say spiders, I'm using the word generically to talk about both. They really don't. They use the term generically between the two, and they don't care. So I don't. So you have one of these animals, and they're whole. They live in. You clear an area around it about a foot and a half diameter, and you put basically a cooking pot over it, just to demarcate the area. And you put a stick and a little stone near it, and you associate yes/no questions with the stick and the stone. And then you cover up the hole with some leaf cards marked with symbols. So you can think of them as being a bit like tarot cards. But most of those cards are stuck in a stack at the back, and they don't actually get referred to very often. Most of the time, what you are doing is that, having asked your question, and you've tapped on the pot as you ask the question, and then you go away and wait, and as it were, the spider comes up to see what was all this noise about. And when it comes up, it moves the cards which were covering the hole, and it puts them either on the stone or on the stick, and that gives you your answer. Except sometimes the cards are not on the stone or the stick, they're in between. Sometimes they're on both. Sometimes the cards have been pulled down into the hole, which is a very bad thing. There are all sorts of options and permutations, but that's the essence of it. I mean, so to give you one of the test questions that you ask on a regular basis, spider, if I'm here alone, choose the stick. If I'm with people, choose the stone. You go away, see what the spider's done, and if you're alone and it's put the cards on the stone, then you know that spider is a liar. So the answer to that is give up. Give up with that spider. Life's too short. You're not going to bother with lying spiders, so you find another one. And actually, there are also medicine. There are particular leaves that you can drop down the hole to feed the spider or crab. And these are held to nourish truth-telling spiders and kill liars. So you do that and then you do your test. The other common test is, am I going to drink beer tonight? And there's only one answer to that question. Yeah, so those are and they say this is calibration.
I was going to say, some people do it with like pendulums and all sorts of other types of divination where there's like the calibration that you do first. Yeah.
They explicitly make the parallel with the things that they do in the village dispensary with the microscopes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so, that's the key thing.
And so would that the calibration then of the yes/no question about something that you know the answer, like drinking beer, would that be done every time that a diviner goes? So is it the kind of thing you have to calibrate every time, or it's like, no, I know the spider. This is where I was going. Every few weeks. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, something like that. And I mean, and if it's a new, because they catch spiders, and each diviner has a kind of an area with several holes in it.
Nice.
And and sometimes they go away, they leave. They're not prisoners or anything. Or they are deemed to be liars, and so you can catch spiders or crabs and bring them to your own area.
Yeah.
And so so there is a turnover of active spiders.
So so I have a number of follow-on questions from that, obviously. So then, you mentioned that this is obviously used in, well, some very, very serious cases. What are the contexts that this is usually done? Like, basically, kind of how often is it used? Like, are there sort of ways that people think about, like, when it's time to go and talk to one of the diviners about something, that it has to be of a certain severity? Or is this something that if you happen to have a friend that does this, you just be like, hey, can I get a question answered?
Yeah. Okay. So I've been working with one diviner for years now, and for a number of years, on my behalf, he kept a log, and he just wrote down the questions that people came to him to ask. So I can answer that quite systematically. So more than half of the questions are to do with health. So it's I'm ill, my children are ill, or it might be my parent, or my spouse, and it often revolves around: should we go to a traditional healer or should we go to the dispensary, which is a coded way of saying, is the ultimate cause of this illness, just illness, or is it caused by witchcraft? And if it's witchcraft, there's no point in just treating the symptoms. You've got to do something to address the ultimate causation. But it's not always necessarily that. I mean, sometimes people say, well, even if it's just illness, the traditional medicine is cheaper. So even if it's not caused by witchcraft, I still want to go to a traditional practitioner. But which one should I go to?
Sure.
And if I am going to go to a state dispensary, there are actually quite a few different dispensaries. And again, which one should I go to? So yes, there are questions about witchcraft lurking in questions of illness, but it's not only that. So that's more than half. Then you've got things like, will I find my goats? They've gone missing. Have they just gone missing, or have they been stolen? There are continual questions about theft. Should I invest in this business.
Yeah. Yeah.
It doesn't get asked a lot, but it does get asked. I want to build a new house. Should I start building this year? And is this a good location?
Yeah.
And my wife is pregnant. Am I the father? My wife is pregnant. Is it going to go all right? Sometimes you get women saying, "Can I trust my husband?"
Yep.
And yeah, so all of life is there, actually.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
one of the things, I mean, going again, kind of making the connection between that and some of the stuff in the show, is, you know, those are true human universals, those questions.
Yeah.
And, you know, there are records of questions asked in the astrology that Michelle works in, because she's been working with logbooks kept by astrologers in the 17th century. And then there are records from some ancient oracles, I think actually in ancient Egypt, but these were Greek oracles, where they used to write the questions on little bits of lead or on potsherds, and of course those survive really well. So in some cases we do have comparable lists of questions asked, and they're so similar.
Absolutely. Yeah. Human nature and human needs for information be the same between cultures and times. That is for sure.
Yeah.
That is really fascinating, because of course one of my questions was going to be, you know, looking at the similarities between these, which obviously there are so many. But yeah, I mean, there's also the element which I find fascinating, particularly with the spider divination, is that oftentimes when people think of forms of divination, we're thinking, well, as modern people, the default is either sort of spirit mediums or tarot readers, probably, you know, or maybe astrology is the first thing people think of. They're not generally thinking of forms of divination that involve animals, which other ancient peoples did. And clearly the spider divination directly, it's a partnership really, with animals, living beings. So, and the Romans had the whole chicken divination with the feeding of the grain and all that to see how they reacted. I keep chickens, so I can absolutely go outside and do that too. It really works. It's very interesting. But are there other, like, how do you feel about that interplay between like that as a system of divination that involves other living beings? Like, how are those? How do you think that interacts? Like, is that a part? Are there other forms of divination in that culture that involve animals, or is that, you know, just the one form that does?
In Mambila, it's the only one. I'm trying to I'm trying to think of the contemporary literature from Africa. There's certainly South Ethiopia, there are contemporary forms of augury. So yeah, so some of those traditions do continue. Yeah.
So with that being said, like you were talking about how it's not really, I guess it's not really I mean, you are obviously a practitioner, so you're initiated in this tradition, but it's not really a big deal to talk about where the information comes from. It's, you have a relationship with the spider, you check it every now and then to make sure, and then maybe it comes from the ancestors, maybe it comes from the earth, maybe it comes from somewhere else, but that isn't really a big concern because
I should say that the stuff I've been saying is not secret. There is stuff which is secret, which is particularly the actual ingredients in the medicine you give. So I have not published any of that information. But general way in which divination works, spider divination works, is very widely shared. And the other thing I should say is, even in the little village where I primarily work, not everybody uses it.
Mm-hmm.
There are some people who say, tried it once, didn't like it, never again. And there are others who say, yeah, this is the best thing since fried bread, if only we had fried bread. And so even in a little, relatively isolated village, there's a huge range of attitudes to all this stuff.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to recognize that.
Absolutely.
And actually, going back to, I've already mentioned Cicero because his book De Divinatione was, I can't remember when it was, I think first century AD. I mean, that's in the form of a dialogue between Cicero and his brother, and one's a skeptic and the other is a great enthusiast. But it's quite clear that that dialogue wasn't building on nothing. People, divination is a very, very old set of techniques, and skepticism about it is probably as old. If you went back to ancient Mesopotamia, there would have been people saying, nah.
Yeah, no, I don't trust those guys with the livers. No, I don't know.
Yeah.
No, it's very true. And I think that ties into kind of how differing cultures think about systems of knowledge and how we acquire knowledge, and where, especially like, for example, the forms of divination that do have to do with large scale choices about like who leaders are and what large scale decisions, if we want to talk about Delphi, like whether a city state is going to be founded or go to war or something like that. We're talking about large scale decisions for people, not just the individual decisions. So how do you think that there are things like culturally about the society that, when you go there and you're a part of it, that allows people, even if they are skeptics, to still trust this enough to say like, yeah, but we accept this as a form of knowledge that, yes, we're all going to communally agree. We're going to make a decision based on that. Like, is there something about the culture, because I'm very unfamiliar with that culture, that you think that's kind of how they all kind of collectively agree to still go along with it? Or is there controversy around that as well?
Good question. I think they would say, I think the skeptics say it just doesn't work. The people who use it and believe in it, what they would point to is that it's completely out of human control. And the other forms of divination, which people are wary of, are vulnerable to manipulation. And so that's like the point of the randomness of tossing the basket, the objects in the basket, is that such is the kind of turnover, you really can't control which objects come to the top. And that's a protection against manipulation. And so randomness is not randomness, as it were. Randomness guards against manipulation and allows the signal to emerge. And so that applies to kind of things like bibliomancy, picking, the verse at random. It applies to so many different forms of divination that the worry is the cynic manipulating. And so you guard against that by whichever means.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that, so I live in an area here in very far northern Vermont where we have an Amish community. They're mostly in Ohio and Pennsylvania, which is true, but now they're moving up to Vermont as well. And some of them are, very good friends of ours now, which I'm very happy about. But I believe, and I've never actually spoken to our neighbors about this, so I've only read it in a book. Haha. Well, but there is still a form of divination that is used. I don't think that any of my friends would call it divination, but essentially that, some leaders in the church for a given community will be chosen by lot, and that is still a way of, yes, there is human involvement in it in order for people to be nominated. Blah, blah, blah. There's a system, but then ultimately, like, the choice is left to God of who then is, like, the lot chooses that person as like a bishop in the community. And I hope I'm not misrepresenting that. It has been about a year since I read the book that mentioned that, but it is the same idea of taking, because humans are fallible, therefore, that randomness or God inspiration, depends on your view, takes that away. Which is one reason why I find it very annoying sometimes when people will always use examples of like, oh, well, I'm sure the Romans and the Greeks, they fixed it for whatever result they wanted. And it's like, no, there's actually a lot of evidence that they didn't. I mean, did people try to manipulate it? Of course, people are people. They're gonna they're gonna try to manipulate things to get what they want. But as a general rule, I think that's part of our sort of I would argue that it's some of our bias as modern people to try to say that everyone was just out to game the system. And then when you are discussing examples in other cultures today that are not doing that, again, there are people everywhere that are going to try to game a system. That's also part of human nature as well. But I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that? Because I always find that discussion kind of fascinating about when people say, oh, well, they're just manipulating the results. And I'm like, maybe sometimes.
Yeah, maybe sometimes, but well, I mean, that's where the spiders are very clearly different from the whistling that I started with. Although, I mean, I have learned the whistling and I can't control it, and I don't actually see how you could. But I mean, there are other forms of divination which Mambila do, which very clearly are to do with shells on strings, and the way they move depends on the tension in the string, so it very clearly could be manipulated. But yeah, you can't control what the spider's going to do. So I mean that, and the same is true of where people do become possessed. Then, I mean, however you want to explain what the state of possession is or means, people are not, whatever their conscious intentions are before this happens, when possessed, their intentions have no sway. So yeah, I think kind of completely blanket cynicism doesn't actually correspond to how people live their lives around the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That is something that's very apparent when you do see the breadth, the incredible breadth of different techniques that have existed and will continue to exist. It's also a fascinating thing, which I really appreciate, that you're including various games and magic 8 balls and stuff like that in the exhibit, because I find, so I am a practicing diviner. I'm a, neo-pagan. I'm a witch. You can call me all sorts of different names. It's fine, whatever. There's lots of different titles. But whatever it is funny to me where I think within sort of the New Age communities, there's sometimes a bias towards the older forms of like, oh, well, if it's very old, then it must be more accurate, and that's also kind of not true, because you can have systems that have, vast history. And for example, you were initiated in a tradition that has an incredible, power to it, which is very different from something that somebody just came up with yesterday, arguably. Doesn't mean that the new system couldn't work or couldn't give value and meaning to a person's life, but they are very different for a reason. But it is interesting to me that people will sometimes bias the older stuff as being more valuable, where if we're kind of talking about how this stuff works, and most practitioners, for example, we were just saying, don't even really put a great deal of emphasis on, is it the ancestors, is it the earth? I don't know. If it works, great. then it's the same thing, because like there are debates within the modern community about like, well, runes are not necessary, Norse runes as kind of modern invention in terms of how we interpret them and use them. Does that mean they're not very effective and cool and interesting? Absolutely not. I use them. I think they're lovely. But was that what people in remote ages past of Scandinavia were doing? Most likely not. It is. Are there elements to the exhibition that you feel will help people kind of see the through lines between how these systems that are very, very old and that are new are similar or dissimilar? Because I think that can be interesting for people, and it can help say like, okay, maybe this is new, maybe this is only 50 years old, and this one is 3,000 years old. But if we really look at them and we see that there are commonalities between the two, that's an interesting thing about human nature or how these things work. And when you see them side by side from very disparate cultures, it's easier to see that and say like, no, this is not a direct connection. We cannot directly say that the Shang Dynasty divination influenced a magic 8 ball. But clearly there's something about them that has some similarity. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so many controversies, and it's I mean, what immediately comes to my mind is the thing about whether tarot symbolism comes from Egypt, and
Yeah.
I
No.
really don't. Well, I would be interested to hear what you think about that. But
I've had tarot historians on, so
yeah, okay. So there is no convincing
no
evidence.
connection. No.
But it seems to me that illustrates perfectly what you were saying, that people want things to be old, whatever their age they were, but whatever age they are, once they were new. And the thing I hope people get from the exhibition is this sense that the questions that arise from people living their lives may be a bit different now, but then far less different than we like to think they are from people in ancient Mesopotamia. We might have a few more choices, but they are just choices. But the actual issues, who do I want to marry? My kid is sick. What should I do? And yeah, and nothing has changed, and nothing will change.
Mm-hmm.
And we all need help. We need we need kind of sources of advice that help us think through the dilemmas, the choices we have. And some people turn to therapy, some people turn to diviners. It's what I'd say.
I think there's a great deal of overlap there anyway, because oftentimes if you're doing readings for people, you're getting into very deep territory. So
Yeah.
a good reader, a good diviner is going to know how to navigate that carefully and thoughtfully to help people. So I think that's also a big part of the art, probably throughout human history, though I don't know that for a fact. I'm curious, so you practice this when you go back and you're with your friends there. Is there any form of divination that you practice when you're home, when you're in like Oxford? Do you ever open a book and use bibliomancy?
No, not really, actually. I mean, the closest I get is Michelle and I, while we've been developing the show, we've been playing with that simulation cartomancy. It's an MIT simulation of I can't now remember what. I'll send you the link.
Yeah. I'll put it in the show.
And we've been playing with that. and actually we've also had a visitor from an academic from Hong Kong who does I Ching. But no, most of the time I don't. Do I? I'm trying to think if I've ever sent back to the village with questions. Because I go reasonably often.
I see.
If I have questions, I just save them up. And I've just been fortunate in my life, I suppose, that I haven't had any kind of really burning things that I felt the need. But that's a good question.
It's interesting because actually, I might have somebody on the show soon that there are, modern day occult practitioners who are looking at the relationships that people are forming with AI and things like that, and the ways that AI and these kind of like generative computer programs kind of can play into either divinatory systems. And I know one person who has sort of been co-creating a set of oracle images and things of that nature with an AI. So that, and it brings to mind the scrying techniques that involve spirit communication, like grimoire tradition, and you're like, well, the spirit is in the machine at this point, so what are you talking to? And it's an interesting time, and kind of some of those technical aspects can play in as well. Instead of bibliomancy, it's relationship with that. But
yeah, I've got a student working on forms of Indian religion in Kerala, where there are photographs of rituals are seen as being imbued with the power of the ritual.
I see.
The question is, are AI generated images of that sort of ritual, which are quite there are characteristic patterns you could tell, so AI can very easily, as it were, generate them. But are the AI generated images powerful in the same way? And she's going to be looking at precisely that. And I could well see people saying, well, AI are divinely inspired, why not?
Yeah, absolutely.
Or they might say no, because there aren't. It will be interesting to know what the local view of this is, and there's going to be potentially a difference between people on the ground in Kerala who can go to the rituals as opposed to the diaspora who can't.
Yeah, that's also true. Yeah, of access to who can go and who can physically go. So how does that change it? Well, there is obviously the information about the exhibit is going to be in the show notes, and anyone who is able to get over to England, I am hoping to be able to get over there in order to see it. That is my plan at the very least. So I would encourage anyone who's going to be physically over near Oxford to go. And are there other, I know that, of course, you have written, I've seen your book. I've actually read a little bit of your book on this. Are there other projects or other things that you want to tell people about related
there is a book associated with the exhibition.
Of course, with the exhibition, yes.
Which is not the catalogue. It is a separate book. I mean, there is an overlap with the exhibition, but it is many short chapters by experts on different forms of divination from around the world, and there's a lot. So there were sadly a lot of stuff in the book which we couldn't put in the exhibition.
Well, that's great for all of us. We'll just get to read the book then. So
yes, and yes, there's then I have written a book about Mambila divination, which kind of features the list of all the questions, the log of questions. And so there's a sort of epidemiology of the questions and stuff about not only spider divination, but some of the other sorts of Mambila divination that they practice. And Yeah, that's what I'd want. Oh, and I should also say, while the exhibition is running, we are running an online questionnaire so people can tell us about the sorts of divination that they use and the questions that they ask and the answers that they get. So that would be really nice if people could
Yeah, that out. I will
fill it
absolutely
out.
make sure that that link is featured so people will remember to fill that out, and I will
Thank you very much.
find my listeners.
Yeah, and yeah, and if you're in Oxford, get in
Yeah.
touch.
Oh, that would be so wonderful. Well, we could keep talking for a lot longer on this, I am sure, but for this conversation at least, I really appreciate your time, and I know that my listeners will really appreciate hearing this. So thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Black moon above, stars overhead. Don't you dare guide me back to my bed. The river is frozen, the pollen path's bare. Don't wait for me, darling, there's thorns